Found.
Ya, deme un segundo. Buenos días a todos y todas. Iniciamos este nuevo ciclo de conversaciones Afrodescendientes y la Cop 16 sobre secuencias digitales. Iniciamos la presentación del día de hoy.
Inicio grabando.
Muy buenos días para todos y para todas. Yo soy Carlos Rosero de Colombia, militante del proceso de Comunidades Negras, participante
I'm afraid I couldn't find
del
anything
Consejo
about that.
Nacional de Paz Afrocolombiano, a nombre nuestro y del conjunto de las redes de
Here's what I found.
afrodescendientes que en América Latina se han articulado para trabajar de manera conjunta en este proceso de la COP16. Les damos la bienvenida a esta
I
conversación que
couldn't
es
find anything
parte
about that.
de una serie de conversas para alistar nuestra participación en la COP16. En
I
América
found this on the
Latina,
web.
en América, los afrodescendientes somos alrededor de 134 millones de personas que tenemos una relación histórica con el territorio, con la naturaleza y con la diversidad biológica. Como quiera que los afrodescendientes en América tenemos alrededor de 200 millones de hectáreas, la mayoría de ellas sin titular de manera colectiva, sin que tengamos garantizado el derecho a nuestra propiedad. Desde lo que somos, desde lo que aspiramos, estamos alistándonos para participar en la COP16 y por eso hoy tenemos una
I found this on the
conversación
web.
con Preston Hardinson, que es un experto en secuencias de información digital, uno de los temas que tiene que ver con el conocimiento tradicional y la propiedad intelectual. Preston ha trabajado por muchos años con nuestros hermanos, los pueblos indígenas del continente y del mundo, asesorándolos en conversaciones al interior de la Convención de la Diversidad Biológica e igualmente
I found this on the
en
web.
conversaciones y negociaciones en la Organización Mundial de la Propiedad Intelectual. Esta es nuestra tercera conversación sobre el tema de secuencias de información digital. Inicialmente se ha conversado sobre los antecedentes. Ayer se conversó sobre los contenidos de fondo de este tema y hoy vamos a conversar sobre, en concreto, cómo va a ser la negociación en el marco de la COP16. Le damos a Preston la bienvenida y nuestro agradecimiento por compartir su conocimiento, su experiencia con los descendientes de africanos, sus sueños y sus aspiraciones. Gracias por estar con nosotros.
Thank you. So today I'm going to have to be very kind of brief. I'm sorry, I apologize for that, but I have to make an airplane flight, and but I think I can cover everything I intended to cover and still leave some time for questions. So don't worry about that. So if we can go to the first slide for day 3. Next slide. This needs to be changed on your end. Go to the next slide. First slide. I'm sorry, I can't, I'm not. There we go. Thank you. Okay, so just to recap, and you'll see the slide several times in the presentation today. Here's the model that the IFB has been working from, and recall that this has been developed since Sharm el-Sheikh, which was in 2018. So this model here is 5 years old. We've pretty much settled on this for the last 3 years, and it hasn't changed much. I made parts of this presentation, and it had some of the same ways of conceptualizing the issues as it does now. So we've had a fairly consistent approach, which again, the IFB has supported a hybrid approach. We believe this was reflected in the decision because the decision says you have to respect the Nagoya Protocol and you have to respect the CBD and Article 8J and other related articles. So we don't think it's much more than that, that system isn't going away because of this new mechanism. We know that corporations would like those to go away. They're not very happy with Nagoya particularly. But we're saying that at least for now, Nagoya is not going away. We don't know where technology is going to take us, so we don't, as I said yesterday, with all of these genes dispersing on their own and moving on their own and the high relatedness, even though corporations are looking for novel traits or novel mutations, novel gene sequences, that they also get most of what they need from the widespread gene sequences. So as technology advances with artificial intelligence, we also know we get more and more gene sequences that are being generated by artificial intelligence. So they're novel gene sequences. They don't occur in nature. At some point, the corporations do need less access to the actual genetic material. They can play around with the sequence information without needing access to a genetic resource. So those are just kind of we're thinking about how to what's called future-proof these decisions so that no matter what happens with the technology, there still will be benefit sharing, there still will be principles of data governance, there still will be protections for human rights and other rights that are recognized. So that's the direction we're going on that part. Then we had the issue of depositing digital sequence information that's created from genetic resources and putting it in database. And there we said we're focusing on these principles of data governance, or what we have called open and responsible data governance. Then there's the issue of raising funds. How do you raise the funds to go into this multilateral benefit sharing mechanism? Yesterday, I pointed out that Goal C says that the funds have to be substantial. So that actually is a very significant word that took a lot of negotiation to get substantial in there. So it is saying that whatever funds are raised through this mechanism, they have to be large. And people are talking about billions of dollars. And we don't know. We've never tried this before. We're very skeptical in some ways. But should they be able to do it, this could raise billions of dollars every single year for projects on the ground. Okay, so next slide. Next slide. Thank you. So now I'm going to do a little bit deeper dive into this. As you know, I mentioned yesterday, we got some wins in the preambular text, which reaffirms that parties have to ensure the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. So these are some extra text than the ones that I showed yesterday, just to show you that there are other texts that you can draw from in the actual Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework that can support work in the digital sequence information area. So the digital sequence information is somewhat separate from the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. It's a separate side agreement. But there is some language within the global biodiversity framework itself that supports certain things that have to happen within the digital sequence information mechanism. So one, it does say that the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities have to be respected. And that's preambular, but it's still directive. Then in the operational text of the Global Biodiversity Framework, we have section C, considerations for the implementation of the framework. And there's a heading that says contribution and rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. In subparagraph A, it says, acknowledges the roles and contributions of indigenous peoples and local communities to biodiversity and its restoration, and that implementation must ensure that the rights, knowledge, including traditional knowledge, associated with diversity, innovations, worldviews, values, practices of indigenous peoples and local communities are respected. That is a very broad statement, and that is, again, that opens it up where most of the work has been focused on the traditional knowledge. This adds innovations, of course, that's in 8J, practices, that's in 8J, but adding this issue of worldviews and values and requiring that those be respected opens up a lot of avenues for work, and you can think about that when you go and prepare for COP 16. And also remember, bring these issues up in front of your governments. That's critical. Let them know that you've read this, you understand it, and there are directives within this framework that tells you some things you need to do. And that now includes worldviews and values. That's part of the framework. More operational text is that any and preservation of traditional knowledge requires free, prior, and informed consent. It also, the parties need to ensure the full and effective participation in decision-making. And then it gives the kind of conditions, but that's including UNDRIP, but also human rights law. So there's plenty of scope for Afro-descendants to see themselves in this language as well. So there's relevant national legislation, international instruments, and human rights law that you can draw upon. And then again, this last clause really just applies to indigenous peoples because it's taken from the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But I imagine the benefits can also go forward in the future and be expanded to Afro-descendants. Because again, this is what's called a non-regression clause in treaties. And non-regression means you can't go backwards. And it says that rights that have been acquired have to be respected, and you can't go back on those. You can't then diminish them at a later time. So that's an important concept in the negotiations. So we have, again, in paragraph G, we added the human rights-based approach, and this is very novel in the CBD, which for 30 years, the parties have rejected any mention of human rights. They kept saying, oh, that's over there. It doesn't have anything to do with us. And we said, well, no, that's not how human rights work, as they actually do apply to you. They apply to all the United Nations system, including the treaties that have been signed. And so the human rights approach says you have to respect, protect, and promote, fulfill human rights. And it also includes the human rights to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And that's open-ended. And what that means is that there are other rights, but they don't explicitly state them, but it is open-ended. And that's, again, a very powerful and new innovation in this Kunming-Montreal framework. Next slide. Next slide. Sorry, I forgot to tell you to advance the slide. So I talked about this slide. This is section C, And you can go to the text and read it, the whole thing in your appropriate language. Next slide. Oh, yeah, next slide. And next slide. Okay, and so this next slide is just what I showed yesterday to also point out that Goal C contains specific obligations to the digital sequence information mechanism, and including the sharing of monetary and non-monetary benefits, the use of traditional knowledge and genetic resources as applicable, and making sure by 2050 that there's going to be traditional knowledge is appropriately protected, so that a lot of the investments of this mechanism will go into the protection, maintenance, revitalization, and intergenerational transmission of traditional knowledge. So it implies that all of those should be a major focus of the mechanism by 2050. Okay, and then we have decision 15.9. As I said, this is a little bit to the side of the Kunming. It's a side agreement. It's not a legally binding agreement because they're not going to go through a treaty process. Nagoya Protocol is a treaty. This is more or less it's an agreement, but it's not a treaty agreement. It will be more like guidelines. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this next slide, I don't want to, it's pretty small and it's probably hard to see. This is just to give you an idea this is just from 2017, which is around the time of Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, and all the activities that occur. So understand that you're coming in at the very end. So if you see the last 3 tags on the top, no, the last 2 tags on the top, that's where you're coming in. So all we have left now, we have an informal advisory committee that has been providing input. We have 2 more meetings of that committee to go. We have 1 more open-ended working group on digital sequence information that will be in Cali, Colombia. And so I'm sure many of you will be at that. And then we have COP16. So this over on the right-hand side is where you need to focus your, be prepared, having read the documents, and then having had your internals. And of course, I'm happy to answer questions, help you out. And if there are any more advice from me that you need, I'm happy to provide it. And then work with your governments and try to get them to support your positions, but also to support the positions the IFB has taken. And that's the critical role I think you can play, and I'll reiterate that at the end. Next slide. Next slide. So this is what I have just said, that we have the informal advisory group meetings. We have an upcoming open-ended working group meeting. And we've actually discussed almost all of this. So this last slide, I'm sorry, I didn't modify it. We've already finished the hybrid approach, mostly, but this time we're going to have a meeting next week. And we will be talking a bit about Nagoya Protocol and how this regime can be made compatible with the Nagoya Protocol. Next slide. Next slide. So I'm going to briefly review the positions that the IFB has taken. So the first one, if you look at that big blue circle, is showing you what's been covered. So the First, I'm going to address the principles of data governance. Next slide. Next. So in the principles of data governance, we've said, again, remember, we're bound by the decision. Whatever we propose has to be in line with the decision that has been taken by the conference of the parties. That is binding. So we're promoting, we have to be aware that there should be access to data. It should be open access. It should not interfere with research. We're, again, constrained. That was the political decision that was made. So we said that data, we take this language from European Union project, which we think is really great, is that databases should be as open as possible, but closed as necessary to protect different things. For example, protecting privacy, making sure that whatever uses are made of digital sequence information do not biosafety, do not threaten biosecurity, do not threaten human security, ensuring that they comply with human rights, including the rights of Afro-descendants, making sure that there is no harm to public safety. So these are reasonable principles that say you can't do research that harms people's privacy. You can't do research that threatens biosafety and so on. So that's the first level of the principles that we're looking for. The other thing that we've also introduced is the idea of biocultural labels. So there is what's called the Local Contexts Initiative. Local context, you can look it up. It is an indigenous initiative, but we believe it applies to Afro-descendants. It applies to, anybody included within Article 8J. And the idea is that you can't force the companies to do certain things. And this is a voluntary regime. There may be some restrictions. But what you can do is provide information to them and cultural information. So what the biocultural labels approach says is there should be some fields that are incorporated into these digital sequence databases that can link to cultural information. The metadata, the reason it's called metadata is it means it's data about the data. It is not revealing the traditional knowledge. This is not about mining traditional knowledge. The labels are meant to allow indigenous peoples, local communities, Afro-descendants, and others to document their own aspirations, their own beliefs, their own values. And again, you don't have to reveal things you don't want to reveal. But the idea is you put in front of the researchers, here's what these data mean to us. And you can even have multiple groups sharing the same species, and the system can allow for different groups to say, well, my group thinks this, and this is what we want when you work with these species. Here's how we would like that to be treated. And the researchers can see multiple values. And if they want to, they can contact those Afro-descendants that hold, that use those species and see what kinds of ways they can work respectfully on their digital sequence information research. So that's biocultural protocols. It's not a legal regime. However, we do know that one of the biggest incentives for companies to do socially positive actions is actually very selfish. It's called reputation value. Companies want to make sure their reputations are good because they know bad reputations get them in trouble, cost them money, and because they get branded as bad citizens, bad corporate citizens. So what they do is if you can get it kind of put into the international system that to be a good corporate citizen, you need to pay attention to these things, then that can really help because it does have an effect. Next slide. So we've also, this is a recent one, and it's something I actually thought of years ago, and we just started talking about it within the IFB working group, but I think you know, and I want people to be careful to understand the suggestion is only supplementary. It's not meant to be, it's meant to be additional to everything else that happens. But one thing that could happen is creating something like the World Heritage List, but you know, focused on global sacred heritage list of sacred species. And again, and for these sacred species, it could be prohibited to do research on them, or if there's research, there may be special prior and informed consent procedures that would apply. And this would really be a virtual list, so it wouldn't require all the apparatus required to run the World Heritage Convention. It really wouldn't require many resources at all. It's just a list. And so there wouldn't be a big bureaucracy. We also see it as a small list. And again, this is not this, because if we say, oh, here's 10,000 species you can't work on, that we will not get consensus on that. And we're not trying to use this as a vehicle to protect all species. It just wouldn't be a good one. But what it is meant to do is to allow each region to come up with 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, maybe even 10 species. Because we're dealing with sacred species, it would not be species that are not well known, because you don't want to advertise those species. You don't, again, this is not to reveal things that are not already fairly well known. But it would be a symbolic list that would say, look, these things are sacred to us, and we've put, say, 100 around the world on a list that says you have to get, there's certain high restrictions on this, or total restrictions on this. And it would be a way for you to get the conversation going, to expand awareness and understanding. Because again, it's hard to get the public, it's hard to get the researchers to even respond if they don't know the problem. And so far with business, one of the more consistent statements we get is, I never knew that, when we start talking about spiritual values of species and what they mean to indigenous peoples, local communities. And you can add the voices of the Afro-descendants to that. What do they mean to you? So this would be a vehicle to get really to establish that conversation. And from that conversation, we can then work to get broader protections. Once the understanding's there, you've built the groundwork in order to then get further decisions that would be have stronger protections. Okay, next slide. Next slide. Okay, there it is. Thank you. So what we're doing now is we have a, and there's a microphone on from somebody. Somebody needs to shut a microphone, please. So we're working with businesses to, and the database operators, to try to see if we can get some of these agreements. We have a meeting next week with business and the database operators, and we're going to try to see if we can get agreements. Now, again, as I said before, one of the values of this being an informal, not a treaty, treaties get boiled down to the lowest common denominator, because they're often kind of weak, because they're compromise decisions. being a voluntary actually means we could get agreements that are stronger than we could get out of governments from business. And I'm not entirely convinced of that, but it's a possibility. We can make it even a stronger. So we could get an agreement for procedures about collecting from your ancestral lands. So we'll have a meeting next week on that, and we're moving. Okay, next slide. Next slide. And now I'm going to move to talking a little bit about the hybrid approach. And about, again, we've said that Nagoya doesn't go away, and the decision said Nagoya doesn't go away. Neither, of course, does the CBD. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, there it is. Sorry, I didn't advance. Okay, so we've said, again, all digital sequence information originates in a genetic resource, and that genetic resource comes from somewhere. And consent is required for access to the genetic resource. Either you're going to have to get consent from the national sovereign, or you're going to have to get this consent from Afro-descendants. Again, there are many genetic resources that are off the table. So anything collected prior to 1993, when the CBD entered into force, that they can do whatever they want to with. Again, that's not ideal, but legally, that's what the treaty says. That's what they agreed to. So, but we've said no DSI in the future should be created from genetic resources without prior informed consent or free prior and informed consent. And I want to remind you that, however, once digital sequence data once you get the consent and they're put into these databases, they're no longer running by the Nagoya Protocol. They will have their own principles of data governance. Again, just because you cannot have with millions, trillions of genetic sequences, it's impossible to even think that Afro-descendants or anybody could keep up with all the requests to say, do you give consent for this? Do you give consent for that? And again, you'd have to sort out what do you have the right to give consent to. That requires a lot of research. You'd have to show that that's something that you own and is uniquely yours. So that would be a mess. And so it has to run by its own rules, and those aren't going to be the kinds of mutually agreed terms you can get out of a bilateral negotiation over genetic resources. If we find, and this is a trigger point, if you do research and you do find one of those endemic genes or those unique genes that are sequences that could only have come from a particular area. So you can find evidence that a sample came from your territory. Now, determining what you actually own in that sample, more broadly is difficult, but there are lots of markers and lots of information that can show you could only have gotten that sample from our lands. And if there's no record that you didn't have, that you had consent, then the researchers then have to go and get your consent. And if they don't get your consent, the remedy would be to remove that sample from the database. And again, you have to be clear, the sample is yours, the underlying genes, some of them, a few of them might be yours, but the majority are not. But you do own the samples from your land. So again, if you can show that a sample has been acquired without consent, the remedy is remove the sample from the database. Next slide. So again, that's just what I said here. Next slide, please. What I just described is what this slide really says. Okay, So there'll also be a need to monitor and assess the provenance, what's called the provenance is a fancy word for it. It's the source of origin. It's where the genetic resources came from for the digital sequence information. That needs to be monitored. And once it gets in the database, we've also suggested there needs to be some monitoring in what the uses are, and just to ensure that everything is complying with the Nagoya Protocol. Next slide. So I'm running a little late, and I'm going to have to end soon and leave time. But so I won't really go into this very much. We have not intervened so much on the funding mechanism, because we believe that's mostly in the expertise of those who have really run these very large global funds. We have some, next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so here are the methods for raising the funds. You can either get a license fee at the research level, such as paying an annual subscription. And by annual subscription, we've done some gross calculations. We think, $250 a year kind of things. And there are other databases that are existing that do require a fee like that for access to the databases. And $250 is not a huge hindrance. And we can always find subsidies to help out Afro-descendants if they want to get such access. The next one is major proposal is saying those products that use DSI, if we can calculate the annual commercial benefits from the use of DSI, then 1% or somewhere, it's probably going to be less, but even say 0.5% of the money that they make goes into this fund would be quite substantial because there's quite a bit of money being made. The problem with this proposal is measuring what products actually, what use DSI and what part of those profits come from the DSI as opposed to other things. A simpler method was proposed by the African group, which is just to say, no, we just take 1% of your annual revenue if you're in an industry that uses DSI. And again, the difference is you don't actually calculate what proportion that DSI contributes. You just take whatever their annual corporate profits are, and you take the 1% or the 0.5%, 0.5%, 0.25%, whatever. And that would be a simple measure. It wouldn't require a lot of calculations or measurement. But we've suggested that you could do the license fee and then use either one of these mechanisms to raise the funds. So we don't, and as I said yesterday, I believe, we don't see that having both a license fee and taking some of the net profits is a form of double taxation. We think you can justify taking it at both places. Next slide. So now we go to the governance of the fund. So on the right-hand side is once you collect the money, there's several things you're going to have to do. One is there may be a mechanism, a global mechanism governance portion, which would govern the funds, it would govern the deposit, it would govern the relationship with Nagoya Protocol, it would govern the principles of data governance, just something that deals with the overall operations of the mechanism. Okay, next slide. You also may need a governance of the fund itself. So these are things like, what are the criteria for funding? What is the allocation of funding? Do we get 50% for indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descendants? Do we get 60%, 80%? And so on, because we do know there is going to be different kinds of allocations. For example, a lot of the mega diverse countries really want to make sure that a lot of the projects come their way. We've also pointed out, however, even the Arctic has its own appropriate biodiversity and it needs to be conserved. Then there's the governance of the data. Now, we haven't settled on this. This is part of what's a big focus of the open-ended working group. We have, in terms of governance of the mechanism, we have a lot of pushback from our being full members of that mechanism. The states do not like that, and right now we have some very strong opposition. So here's the options that we have. First of all, on the governance, it could be one single mechanism where there's just one overall mechanism that takes care of the mechanism, the fund, and the data, or these may be kept separate and they may have their different governance bodies. So we don't know yet. Once that's established, in whatever form, we can have permanent members that have equal status, including they can have, if you jump down, they can be observers with equal rights to speak or intervene, and they may even be able to participate in decisions. Again, that's going to be very difficult because it runs up against the convention, the rules, the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. They may be observers as rights to speak and intervene, but not to take part in the decisions. And they may be just observers without the right to speak or intervene. So those are all three potential outcomes that have been used in different UN processes. Of course, we're angling for being part of the governance system. There is a little bit of a dilemma because, again, it depends on the size of the governance system. If you have only, say, 12 members, usually parties will say we want at least 2 members. So we're talking, and there are 5 UN regions, that means 10 members to start with. And as they start, if they put in any other members, then of course that becomes more and more bulky to do the governance. And so they're probably not going to have a mechanism that has 100 full members. They might, but if it's large, they might. Again, if they go through a very large group with a consensus process, there's more scope to adding full members. What I think is more likely is we may not, if there is a governance of the mechanism itself as opposed to the overall mechanism, we're less likely to get in the governance of the mechanism. We could get in as observers. We're more likely, I think it's very likely we can get into the governance of the fund. But again, it really depends on the size as to how many we can crowd into a room. And also there will be this battle over what are the rights and of anybody who is an observer in those rooms as opposed to the parties. So, the ideal would be one from, at least one representative from every 7 sociocultural regions. But then we also have to, add, right now that usually is dominated by indigenous peoples. We still don't have a lot of representation by local communities, and then we'll have, need to add the representation by Afro-descendants. But we also have academics, we have civil society, we have business also saying, well, if they're in with the governance, why aren't we? As I said yesterday, we've said, well, there's a difference in that we're the ones who live where biodiversity is, and at the end of the day, the funds are going to go to projects in our territories, and we're going to have to implement them. You've created this problem that we now have to fix for you. And so actually, we really should be the focus of the decisions and of the governance for the most part, not the technology and not the businesses and not the other groups. And so we really need to be there as major, as full members. But still, you're going to have debates over who gets to be a member. If they're full members, there's going to be debates over that. So it's the big part of the open-ended working group, I believe, and it's our upcoming meeting. Next. So finally, I'm going to end with talking very briefly about the non-monetary benefits. Next slide. So again, the shift from Nagoya to this global mechanism for DSI is that instead of being kind of neutral as to what benefits are raised, they can be monetary or non-monetary. This mechanism raises money for projects, and the projects all have to benefit biodiversity conservation, ecosystem conservation, and sustainable use. And so it's shifting from this bilateral approach, which is through contracts. And in the contracts, again, the benefits can be anything you agree with a corporation or a researcher. But now we're raising money for a fund that then funds projects. So in a way, there's no real monetary benefit sharing, or there may be very little. That's also under debate, whether there should be monetary payments to, say, countries who then decide how to spend the money. But the focus isn't on the monetary, it's on projects. And so most of the models on non-monetary benefit sharing have focused on bilateral models. And under a bilateral model, the non-monetary benefits comes from whoever you made the contract with. So if you made a contract with a biotechnology firm, they only have expertise in biotechnology. They don't have expertise in much else. So most of the non-monetary benefit sharing has been thought of in terms of technology transfer, training, things that companies can do. So that's called in-kind benefit sharing. However, with the multilateral system, I think we can think very broadly about non-monetary benefit sharing and who needs to share non-monetary benefits. And what we're promoting is the idea that it should be embedded in the wider system of the CBD, and the non-monetary benefits can come from more than just the corporations and the companies and the scientists. It can come from actions the governments can take, and actions that funders and philanthropists can take. Some of these kinds of funding, non-monetary funding, can include reducing the harms to you, getting the pressures off and the stressors, recognition and effective enforcement of your rights. Now, even though that's an obligation, if they start really enforcing, that's a benefit. It may be an obligation, but it's still a non-monetary benefit. Involvement of women and youth in the activities, and potentially even children. I'm not sure how children would be involved in the DSI, but we could think of some ways, I'm sure. And participation in governance and so on. So there's a wide range of things we can do. Next slide. Okay, and so here's my conclusions. The multilateral benefit sharing mechanism is meant to capture research and corporate utilization of genetic resources that have been converted to digital sequence information. So it's not use of GRs. It is a utilization of GRs. That's a technical distinction, but I walked through it yesterday. We believe it is additional to the Nagoya Protocol. It does not undermine it. Most of the advice to the parties has already been developed and presented to them, although we need to clarify some details, and the details are quite important. For example, at this meeting next week, we will be trying to develop the specific principles of data governance that we want to propose, or a process to develop those principles. So at the end of the day, remember, this is still probably going to be what's called a framework decision, and we can't develop everything by the time of COP16. So we'll probably, on some of these things like principles of data governance, it could go to specifying a process to develop those principles. But there's also a chance, and we'll see next week, that we can get agreements to what the principles are now, take them to this COP or to the open-ended working group, and try to get those adopted. Now, I want to mention on the terminology change, and again, this is not to be at all discriminatory or to say you shouldn't be doing this. I want to promote you doing this. This is not a problem. But practically, you need to understand that changing the terminology is, I'm putting it diplomatically by saying it may be difficult. It will be difficult by COP16, because all these terms have to be debated. They have to be understood in order to get to consensus. And getting peoples put into the terminology took 5 years. Also, doing it in the DSI without having done it at the higher level, like at the COP, is not going to really work, because again, COP is the one who is in control of all of this, and these terminology changes occur at that level. I mentioned the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. You have to pay attention to that. When we got the peoples in, the threat that Canada made was that if you want to change the meaning of this convention and add this term, you have to open the entire convention. And once you open it up, anything can be changed. And I'm not really sure I believe that. And I don't believe in the decision that, but I'm not an expert in the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. I do point out other treaties have changed their language without having to open up the whole convention, and we believe human rights apply regardless of whatever language that you adopted in some time past on your treaty. Regardless, these are just views, and we don't know until we get there how the parties are going to react, but I can tell you it is going to take a lot of work to get the Afro-descendants included, and I encourage you doing that work. But again, we can always try. There's no harm in trying, but it's going to be difficult to do it by COP16. So, but you do have a large role, and I've said this several times, and you can help add to the agenda here. Look through these things, and if you think there are things that have been left out as in the current IFB position, please let us know. The most important is once we get some more clarity on what we're asking the parties to do, in other words, precise language, once we get our principles developed, which is going to be in the next month, we'll have most of this done, and we'll start circulating some things. Go to your parties before they even get to the working group. Go to your countries before they get to the COP16. That's critical. They are having their own discussions, and they're determining their positions. And when they go to these meetings, they often go with instructions. you have to change their instructions so that they're supportive of our positions. And that's a major task and role that I encourage everybody to do. And now I'll take some brief questions. I can't spend too long because I really do need to do my final packing and go. So I leave for a trip in about 30 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Preston. I think we have some feedback here. Are you hearing feedback at all?
A little bit.
Sheila, you're muted.
Now you're muted.
The idea is to have a few questions after that amazing presentation. And, there's just so much rich material here. There's already been many discussions around how to set out a route for achieving the recognition of Afrodescendants in COP 16, but you've also brought forward a very important point, which is the shift from communities to peoples or nations. And there was a mention around Canada bringing up the fact that this will need to be completely reopened. I think there are a lot of concerns by various nation states around the ability of nations to continue to control what is the implications of the genetic biodiversity mapping, patenting, and all of that implies going forward. So I guess one of the questions I had was around the tools. You've given us a few of those tools to look at how Indigenous and Black or Afro-descendant peoples can start to consider that route to have recognition. The free, prior, informed consent is a huge aspect of it. But are there other tools that are out there? UNDRIP is one of them that comes to mind, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which has loopholes, unfortunately, in it as well. But I guess I just open it up to ask you that first, if there are other tools that maybe go beyond this a particular topic, but that have implications for it, if you know what I mean, that aren't specific to biodiversity, but to governance, to aspects that you brought up here. But so I'll leave that as maybe a first question as we get things going, and ask if anybody here who's with us in the session has any questions, and can put those in the chat, or send them to me, and we can post those here for Preston. So I'll pass the word over to you. I know we're ending now. You have to get off to a flight, and we're at the hour about, but if there are any pressing questions, now would be the time to include those. And I'll pass you the word, Preston. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer questions. And I think that was a good summary. Again, I want to encourage you to do whatever work you need to do. The idea wasn't to discourage you on this work, but just say there are many practicalities. If you haven't been to a convention on biological diversity meeting, there's just a way that it works, and adding terminology it's going to have to be discussed over time. I'm not discouraging you from doing work to see what you can get done at COP 16, and you could be amazed if you do it. But in order to get that, you're going to really have to work with regions, and you're going to have to get big blocks of countries to support you, because it's going to have to be important for them to support you. And as I've said, you do have an opportunity because of Colombia's role in the vice presidency of the meeting. So you've got an opening there, but again, there's no magic bullets or magic wands. It will have to go through a consensus process with parties, and at the end of the day, they're the ones making the decisions. So get your advocates, and again, get them lined up before you go to these meetings. That's why I say it's critical you start talking with your governments and the agencies to get their instructions changed and clear before they even show up to the meetings.
Fantastic. And one of the points that I wanted to bring up was also related to the reparations agenda around the financing piece, but more than that, there's a political implication for the reparations process, historical reparations for Afro-descendants in particular, Indigenous peoples as well. But there has been a proposal to work more closely with African countries and Afro-descendants, the 6th region, just to see if you had any comments on that generally before we close here.
Yeah, there's a concept in law called retroactivity or retrospectivity. Those are the English words. I don't know the Spanish. What that means is you can't go back in time and change things. You have to look forward. Now, we're not against reparations. We've kept reparations as a specific term out of these discussions because, again, they're so politically sensitive on digital sequence information that it could blow up, really blow up the negotiations. However, the purpose of the fund is really to do those reparations. I mean, that's it. Again, as I've said, you can't just, I've given this picture. Can't have a neighbor that burns, tires all day in their backyard, plays really loud, obnoxious music, throws their garbage into your backyard, throws pails of oil, dirty oil into your backyard, and then once a month, a fistful of money and throws it over the fence and calls it all good. So benefit sharing alone can't solve all the problems. And as I've said, these are problems not generated by you. These are historical problems that do really require reparation and repatriation for some things. But if you introduce that language in this sensitive negotiation, but the idea is if we do get a substantial fund that's providing these billions of dollars, that could, really help. And also if this non-monetary benefit sharing starts to reduce those stressors and pressures, and also you use the language of the Kunming Montreal Biodiversity Framework to help reduce those pressures and stressors, then the benefit sharing can help you gain on all the problems, including climate change and pollution and all of those things. So I'd be careful about introducing specifically the reparation language because, again, in this particular section of the CBD, it would be very, very, probably very disruptive. But if you find states that say, yeah, we want to introduce that language, again, the trick is getting groups of states to say if that's what you want, then get support for it. But it's not always good just to go on the mic just to create. If you just go on the mic and you haven't prepared the ground and you create chaos with some statement and no party is prepared for that, then it can actually harm us. So you have to prepare the ground. You have to work with the states.
Thank you so much for that. These are really important elements because there's a much broader context, I would say, to the reparations conversation. And then there's the specificity of the negotiations underway, as you said. We're closing here. I wanted to thank you again so much, Preston, for your time these last 3 days. It's been a huge amount of learning for those that are participating, and we will continue to support the capacity building aspect and around this. So I will pass the last sort of message of closure to Durban. And thank you again for being with us here today.
Buenas para todos y todas. Quisiera invitar a quienes nos acompañan en este momento en este espacio, a Carmen, a Marilyn, a Paola, a que también puedan compartir sus apreciaciones con relación a la participación y a lo que en estas 3 sesiones Preston nos ha compartido con relación al tema de secuencia digital, para poder hacer un poco más interactivo también el espacio y poder conectar con lo que, con lo que nos estamos preparando como país, como región, y en el caso del pueblo afrodescendiente, con un propósito muy claro de buscar el reconocimiento dentro del convenio de diversidad biológica. Entonces, para que no quede esta conversación como en un asunto, en una sola dirección, sería bueno que Marilyn y tenemos también a Carlos nuevamente, que fue quien hizo la apertura, que pueda también hacer una retroalimentación sobre lo que en estas 3 sesiones em, em, Preston nos ha compartido, conectando con la discusión política que hoy como país, como proceso, nos convoca a este escenario de la COP 16. Entonces, no sé si Marilyn, Carmen, Paola se animan a participar.
Eh,
Creo que Paola está lista ahí con la mano arriba.
Hola, buenos días. ¿Me escuchan?
Sí,
Bueno,
Paola.
buenos días, Preston. Muchísimas gracias por estas charlas. Realmente han sido para nosotros muy importantes. Las 3 sesiones hemos tenido muchas herramientas también, además porque este tema es muy novedoso también para nosotros, en el proceso que estamos llevando también de fortalecimiento de capacidades con las organizaciones afro. Entonces me parecieron muy importantes y le quiero agradecer mucho por estas 3 sesiones. Nosotros esto lo vamos a tener también como insumos para un proceso que vamos a realizar en los próximos meses, con el proceso de comunidades negras, con el ánimo también de poder profundizar más estos conceptos y poder aportar a la actualización del Plan Nacional en Biodiversidad, y a las discusiones que se van a dar también en el marco de la COP 16. Entonces, cualquier información también que adicional que nos quieran suministrar de materiales también van a ser muy importantes, para poder nosotros también hacer esa labor de, de también transmitir esto que usted nos ha transmitido, también a las comunidades, y estaremos con el proceso de comunidades negras en este proceso. Muchísimas gracias.
Darwin, yo tomo la palabra para agradecerle a Preston y decir que este es un primer paso, para comenzar a revisar no solo este tema, sino muchos otros temas que guardan relación con la preparación hacia la COP 16. Sin embargo, la preparación y la participación hacia la COP 16 es un solo paso, y ya después de la COP 16 viene la tarea más grande, que es, por un lado, el seguimiento, y por el otro lado, revisar cómo se implementan las decisiones que se toman en el marco de la conferencia de las partes a nivel nacional y territorial. Sin duda alguna es un reto enorme revisar temas como el fondo de distribución de beneficios y mirar cómo en efecto se llega a un paso real y práctico de financiación directa. Yo sé que Preston se tiene que ir, pero es muy importante saber que esta es una sola parte de la discusión, información de secuencia digital, pero hay otros temas de vital importancia para los compañeros y compañeras afrodescendientes, y también claramente para todas las personas que van a estar participando en la conferencia de las partes, incluyendo el grupo del cual yo formo parte, siendo Cancuama, de los pueblos indígenas. Decirles también que vienen otras sesiones. La próxima sesión va a ser específicamente sobre el artículo 8J, también en articulación con el Foro Internacional Indígena para la Biodiversidad, y también vamos a estar hablando del Marco Mundial Cumming-Montreal para la Biodiversidad. Entonces, estas van a ser sesiones que se articulan con esta primera fase sobre información de secuencia digital, y es determinante que lo tengamos en cuenta para seguir acompañando estos espacios y estos procesos de formación y prepararnos para participar en los escenarios preparatorios y en la conferencia de las partes en sí. Muchísimas gracias, Darwin, por el espacio.
Marilyn, ¿tiene algún aporte para...
Rápidamente, pues por la premura del tiempo y los tiempos del compañero que nos acaba de ilustrar, agradecer también a Raymond pues por su disposición para la traducción del espacio. Muchas gracias, creo que las tareas son muchas, creo que es demasiada información para muchos de nosotros y que hay que seguirlas trabajando, por supuesto, y de vital importancia para la protección de la cosmovisión de nuestros pueblos. Muchísimas gracias por el espacio.
Bueno, entonces en este sentido, agradecer a Preston toda la disposición en estas 3 sesiones, compartiéndonos su saber, su conocimiento, su experiencia alrededor del tema de secuencias digitales en el contexto del convenio de diversidad biológica, y a los compañeros que asisten hoy en este escenario y a quienes nos están viendo a través de las redes sociales del proceso de comunidades negras, por estar siguiendo y estar participando activamente en esta discusión muy importante para el proceso y también para la humanidad. Entonces, como lo decía Carmen ahora, no se desconecten. Seguiremos programando esta serie de conversaciones y discusiones alrededor de la COP 16 en Colombia y del Convenio de Diversidad Biológica. Nos despedimos sin más, sino agradecer por la disposición y el apoyo en este escenario. Gracias.